Well, it seems that the single strongest faction of Ninth Edition isn't the strongest anymore. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids, continuing our series of looking through all the points and rules updates from this massive points overhaul and the Balance Dataslate with a load of rules changes. We've done the majority of the other factions now we're on to Tyranids, the army that I think just about everyone could see fairly brutal balance changes coming for. Most of the time in 40k there's at least a few decent factions that are in contention at the top, though prior to this update I would have argued that Tyranids were perhaps head and shoulders above just about anything else. Their datasheets are just brutally efficient and all round strong. They've got some amazing power pieces like the Hive Tyrants swooping around destroying everything, and Harpies chucking out far more firepower than you'd expect for the cost, all backed up by an awesomely powerful psychic phase, usually belching out far more mortal wounds than even the Thousand Suns could muster. Games Workshop has hit the bugs very hard though, both with points and rules nerfs, so let's go through and talk about how Tyranid armies might adapt. Points changes first, and this nerf feels very similar to the Abmech one. Basically just a massive raft of points increases, targeting just about every single competitive unit in the Tyranid list all at once. Odds are if there was a unit that was commonly spammed at tournaments, then typically this list will have nerfed it. I think I would have expected most of these to go up in a balance update, but a few of the percentage rises are rather brutal and more than I would have expected. It's interesting that there was a leaked list of Tyranid points cost that went round the other week. Interestingly, they seem to have got some of the things dead on, but some of the things not quite right. I wonder if that might have been an early draft of the points cost. In any case, if we go through in order, first of all, Hive Tyrants have both gone up 20 points base, so an 11% nerf on their standard stat line, and the Swarm Lord has also been caught into that nerf as well. Probably wasn't all that much necessary, as people tended to run the standard Hive Tyrants a fair bit more than him. I think they're still good solid all-round datasheets. They punch very hard in close combat, the Hive Tyrant can charge ridiculous distances, and the Walking one is both a lot tougher and can also pack something like a heavy venom cannon as well. They haven't just received a points nerf though, they have also received a rules nerf, as we'll get onto in a second. Next up, Old One Eye's gone up 15 points to 235, that's a 7% nerf there. Again, I'm not enormously convinced that he necessarily needed it loads. I was sort of expecting the regular Carnifexes to go up, and I feel like Games Workshop just lumped him in with the package. It was certainly by no means bad, but I just don't think he's looking all that efficient at 235. Next up, Death Leaper has gone up 25 points to 120. He's up a massive 26%, and it's genuinely quite a lot less of an efficient unit now. Death Leaper saw play in a whole load of competitive lists. He brings some pretty epic countercharge to butcher a whole load of elite infantry, and perhaps more importantly has objectives secured that you can just throw onto objectives and almost guarantee that you're going to flip an important point away from your opponent. Combine that with being unshootable at long range, and you've got a very survivable and annoying little character that will help win the mission. A lot more passable at 120 though, I think. Next up, Tyranid Warriors and Raveners both went up 5. I think both of these again were kind of expected. They were big mainstays in competitive Tyranid lists, though as I said when I talked about the Tyranids the last time, I do feel that just raising the warrior points cost just feels a little bit lazy. They basically seem to be priced as if they had Death Spitters and Bone Swords, the best and most destructive damage dealers, and I felt like maybe they could have gone up subtly in points, and a few of the other lesser played choices could have been a bit cheaper. I still think both of them are usable at the new points, but again they feel a bit more middle of the road and less standout. Pyrovores went up by 10 points. Sorry, I made a small typo there. They went up 10 from 30, not plus 30. When I first saw their datasheet, I must admit they did look just crazily undercosted for the stats. Massively tough, an absolutely awesome flamer attack, and not even terrible melee as well. Not at all surprised that they went up, but going up all the way to 40 does seem a little bit on the punishing side. I think they do have their issues just for delivering them. They move fairly slowly and have at least relatively short-ranged guns that don't deal with heavies quite as well. They've also massively taken the hammer to the Maliceptors too. The Maliceptor's been hit by a fairly classic Games Workshop double nerf here. First they had that FAQ which meant that you couldn't use the extra psychic power stratagem on him, and also stated that the psychic action took up one of his casts as well, so he's effectively had his mortal wound output cut in half, and now he's gone all the way up from 170 points to 220, to the point where I'd guess that most people are probably not going to bother bringing one. Don't get me wrong, he was still very dangerous at the 170 point cost even after the nerfs. There's not a lot of durable monstrous creatures in the game that can just belch out somewhere around 6 to 10 mortal wounds each psychic phase, but I think I would have been a bit more inclined to go by something like 20 to 30 points up rather than a massive 50. Next up, all 3 flavours of Carnifexes went up. They all went up 15, whether it's the base one, the Screamer Killer, or the Thornback. Again, perhaps just a little bit more than I might have expected, and maybe might have thought 10 or so. They don't seem particularly stand out compared with the other Tyranid monstrous creatures now, which I think is kind of a shame for a fairly iconic unit. The Exocrine went up 30 or plus 18%, so another sizable nerf there. That one had solid firepower, but I sort of feel that people might just switch to Tyrannifexes with rupture cannons. I don't feel that they were all that far behind already, and with a massive 18% nerf, I feel like the Tyrannifexes are going to be a bit more of a choice. Speaking of which, the acid spray was the actual thing that was nerfed on the Tyrannifex. That's the general purpose strength 6 damage 2 flamethrower that was quite good at chewing through marines. Still seems kind of usable. It was only up 9% or 15 points. As I mentioned, I feel like the rupture cannon genuinely is looking like quite an interesting choice for the Tyrannifex now. They are very durable, and that does provide some long-range anti-tank threat. The Tyrannicide went up 10 points to 110, so plus 10% there as well. I think maybe that was slightly in reaction to at least a couple of tournament lists that I saw where people were just spamming them en masse, as they were just really annoying monstrous creatures. They could make it quite hard for enemies to secure objectives with the Auspex special rule. Maybe the raise is just to make them a bit more focused on actually being transport things rather than actual things you want on the battle line. And finally, the Harpy and Hive Drone both went up a bit. The Harpy went up 15 points base, and then the Heavy Venom Cannons also went up an extra 10 points each, so that means there's a 35-point increase overall on the Heavy Venom Cannon Harpy. That's a 20% nerf, so it's definitely way less efficient now. And the Harpy change really doesn't surprise me whatsoever. I think again they were in contention for one of the single most undercosted datasheets in 40k. I feel like Stranglethorn cannons might well compete with the Heavy Venom cannons now. You still get a whole load of firepower, and they can still be bought in for 175. Finally, the Hive Crone also went up 10. Kind of an interesting choice, as that never really saw any play compared with the Harpy. I don't know if maybe they were worried that people would just switch to that if they nerfed the Harpy. I guess it isn't too bad with its auto-hitting infantry dual cannon attack, and those tentacled missile things. Perhaps notably, the things that were most unchanged out of a lot of competitive Tyranid lists were Zoanthropes and Neurothropes. Zoanthropes are almost always wanted due to getting that very nice invul save synaptic imperative, plus having some durable models that throw out quite a lot of mortal wounds each turn certainly isn't bad. And Neurothropes can also chip into the damage thing, provide some really reliable psychic powers, and that very nice cast on 3d6 psychic buff. I guess the buff is actually maybe a little bit less relevant now that Maliceptors aren't going to be anywhere near as attractive. Overall, it's a huge amount of points nerfs, a lot of them tending to be on the 10% plus side, so fairly sizable, and it's safe to say that Tyranids are going to be massively weaker than they were before this update. Of course, that isn't the end of the pain for the Tyranids though, as they also got a fair few rules changes as well. We did cover these in brief the other day, but just to go over them again quickly. Hive Tyrants have basically got worse in two different ways. First up, if you include one, they must be your warlord, so you can't nominate something like Deathleaper to be the warlord for that objective secured, or put it on something like a safer Neurothrope. I guess it does make sense lore-wise, but it does mean that they're not quite as flexible, and the actual main disadvantage is probably the second nerf, the one to Synaptic Imperatives. That one basically means that Synaptic Imperatives only ever work when the warlord is on the battlefield, i.e. not either in reserves or dead. It means that if you do have a Hive Tyrant, you're going to have only one in the detachment due to the normal rules. Then that one actually must be the Warlord, so that means you can't afford to play too risky with it, otherwise your army-wide abilities will just go away for the rest of the game. It definitely puts Hive Tyrants in a bit of an awkward spot. On the one hand, they're really quite efficient datasheets that really want to be getting stuck into the enemy and just fighting along the front lines alongside the rest of the swarm. But on the other hand, they genuinely are a big reward to the opponent if they can kill them early. It is going to make the rest of the Tyranids just that bit easier to handle. I suppose it might not be the worst thing in the world if you've got a very fast-moving Hive Tyrant with wings, adrenal glands, and then aim to use that overrun stratagem to jump back behind some Tyrant guards. I guess you just have to be extra careful to make sure that he wouldn't be exposed until it doesn't really matter so much for your plans. Finally, for the rules changes, I think maybe one of the things that Tyranid players seem least happy about is the change to the adaptive part of the Hive Fleet adaptations. Basically, each Hive Fleet get their set one, and then they combine it with one of the ones from their tables. Usually the idea was that you'd see your opponent's army, then you got to make an adaptation to them to better handle the foe. Now you just have to include it on your army list, so you make the commitment pre-game. It basically takes away quite a powerful bit of list tailoring that the Tyranids could afford to do. Arguably, it might not have been the biggest advantage that they needed. I don't think anyone would have missed this at all if it hadn't been initially present in the codex. It's just a bit sad as it did feel kind of fluffy for them. The idea that they evolve and get better at fighting favoured foes. Overall, between an army-wide special rule nerf and also loads of points updates, Tyranids are going to be far more hard-pressed on the tables. I think a lot of top Tyranid armies could be going up easily by around 200 to 250 points. It does kind of depend on the exact units taken and how much support stuff was coming along. As I mentioned, Hive Tyrants are in a bit more of an awkward spot now. They still have powerful data sheets, particularly with that Reaper of Obliterax, which is just as strong as ever, but they now need to be extra careful that they stay safe, while also trying to have a decent effect on the game. For the adaptive traits, you're going to have to select them pre-game now, so I guess it's going to come down to the powerful Hive Fleet ones or the ones on the adaptive tables. Perhaps for the adaptive tables, the +1 to charge is quite nice, or heroic interventions across the army. Or for the lurk table, maybe things like +1 to your cover save, or objective secured monsters seem like the best. That AP -1 counting as 0-1 could be really punishing against certain armies, but now you can't buy it in reactively, it's just not as good. My guess is that Tyranids are going to be looking a lot more mid-tier than they were. I personally don't think that this is going to be enough to make them one of the weaker armies out of the game. They've got a whole ton of options in the codex, and a lot of their datasheets were just crazily strong before. I think they'll still be able to afford to bring a decent threat, even if they've got one less unit on the table or something. It might actually be a bit more interesting, as a few of the datasheets that were just a little bit below the surface might see a bit more play now, and I think there are plenty of interesting choices. I think the Harpy is still absolutely great. I feel like people might be tempted by those Stranglethorn cannons now. You've still got an 175 point flyer that does bombs, a bit of anti-infantry and potentially melee, and it can also double down with 10 strength 8, AP -2, damage 2 shots. That's still very efficient given how mobile flyers are. Perhaps the Rupture Cannon Tyrannifex will take over a bit from the Exocrine. I felt like it was probably the weaker of the two before, but is now probably a bit stronger now the Exocrine was nerfed. I wouldn't be surprised to see Neurothropes and Zoanthropes in most lists still, particularly Zoanthropes because of the Synaptic Imperative. And otherwise there might be a few more points for things like expendable fast-moving objective secured like Gargoyles or Hormagaunts, and perhaps the Parasite of Mortrex will be a bit more tempting as the objective secured Warlord trait bringer. He was often filled in the same role as Death Leaper, moving very quickly with that same Warlord trait and spawning some Rippers to help hold those points as well. I'd be very surprised if Tyranids aren't doing at least somewhat well after the changes, but I feel like they'll probably not be one of the top factions in the game. So let me know what you think of the Tyranid changes down in the comments below. Which of the nerfs are the most painful, and which bioforms do you think might come to the fore to fill the gaps in the ranks? I'll look forward to having a read over your thoughts and ideas. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. There'll certainly be a fair bit more to talk about for the rest of these Balance Dataslate points updates. It's going to be interesting taking a focused look at a few more factions. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.